Story 1. Be me. Never can sleep in childhood bedroom. Have nightmares that always revolve around the room itself somehow. Eventually move out. Ask mom and dad about it. Dad straight up admits he used to see shadow people in that room, and mom says that she never liked going in there. Found out a few years later, some girl had hung herself in there before we lived there. I was told this from some old-ass neighbor. Story 2. A girl I grew up with went missing when we were in high school, and everyone in town speculates the pastor knocked her up and killed her trying to give her an abortion. After she disappeared, the pastor started acting weird, going out of town for church business and making someone else lead the sermons. Her diary mentioned being in love with a man whose initials match his, but because there's no body, there's no way to prove he did it. It's all speculation, but it's still terrifying because we were so close. Story 3. I lived in rural South Carolina in the rolling hills my entire childhood, and I often explored the massive expanse of forestry I had around my house. There were miles and miles of greenery. Around the time I was 11, I started taking a gun with me into the woods because of a semi-close call I had with a coyote once a few months ago. Mom said that I could since she knew that I was taught how to shoot and be safe well enough. Anyways, around the time I was 13 or so years old, I had several strange experiences in the forest, including seeing large groups of flashlights and hearing men speaking somewhat far off, which was strange since, after all, it was my property. But by far, the scariest thing that happened to me was when I was around the age of 14. I was walking through the woods at about 2 a.m. on a weekend, by myself as usual, and I was carrying my mother's Ruger Vaquero in my cowboy holster. I had a big thing for westerns. After another hour of walking, I was really far from my home, and I was approached by a grown man who was probably in his mid to late 40s. He was very fat, and he just stared at me. I told him to go away because it was my property, and he smiled in my direction, as if he were looking over me instead of at me. I was getting really creeped out. I began backpedaling and he took a step towards me, at which point I pulled my vest up and aimed the revolver directly at his chest and exclaimed that this is my property, and that I could legally shoot you right now. At which point he turned tail and ran away. I hoofed it back home and was really shaken up for some reason, probably more so than I should have been. Granted, that guy was incredibly scary looking. Story 4. This one isn't really paranormal, but it still screws me up. Be me. Wake up one night to the sound of a cat going completely mental. Figure that it's just 2 cats duking it out, not something that uncommon. Having trouble falling asleep because the wailing persists for hours. The wailing starts getting weaker until it finally stops. Wake up early because of school. Take a look at the lawn before I leave, because the sounds came from there. I see a cat lying there. Go closer and inspect it. Eye is hanging out of its socket. It's bloody and bruised. Obviously been world star hip-hopped the fuck out of this plane of existence. But there was something that really made my skin crawl. It had been nailed to the lawn with a long wooden stake through its body. In other words, some screwed up dudes just beat the ever-loving shit out of a cat and then hammered a stake through it so that it would slowly and painfully die on our lawn. Police were called. Wasn't much they could do. I stayed home from school that day. Story 5. I was just another 8 or 9-year-old kid living in Mormon land, Utah, wasting a summer vacation while life was still fun. Out behind my house, practically in my barnyard, was a huge dike at the mouth of a canyon coming from some nearby mountains. There was a drainage pipe that acted as an outlet for the little water that came down from the canyon at the base of the dike. Right above this big pile of accumulated sand was the perfect natural sandbox with the perfect natural garden hose providing a constant and steady trickle of water. It was easily visible from the back windows of my house, and this allowed my mom to watch me play from within the house, and she let me mess around all day at the base of the pipe. I was a huge dinosaur nut, and had a bunch of those cool, nice Carnegie collection models that a destructive kid like me should never have. We'd take a bucket full of these things out to the natural sandbox every day and create little river systems and immerse myself in the anarchist society I created for my dinosaurs, sitting out in the sun for hours and getting sunburned pretty much every day with a neighborhood kid who tolerated me. Did this on and on for the majority of the first half of summer. Nostalgia.sad. In mid-July, as it happened every year, it started to rain more, and one night we got hit with a decent thunderstorm. Lay in bed that night, no doubt anticipating the new environment I'd have to play in the next day. Got up at an hour which no doubt pissed off my parents, not bothering to wait for my friend, and headed right out to my natural little sandbox. A significant amount of water was coming out of the pipe, and a small pond had formed where I usually played. I played with my lake for about a half an hour as the sun rose a little. It had to be 7 or 8 in the morning. Was sticking dinosaur toys in the shallow mud and trying to balance some on pieces of floating wood debris when something floated next to my hands. I wanted to push it away because it was on a collision course with one of my improvised boats, but it ended up recoiling. You know when you're a little kid and something startles you so badly that you don't scream, but you just kind of stare and retreat back a little with your heart jackhammering? That's what I did. The thing was about the size of a guinea pig, and I use an animal as a size comparison because it was definitely an organic thing, but it wasn't any living animal or thing that I'd ever seen before with my own eyes and haven't seen since. And it still freaks me out to think about. It floated in that low current region at the edge of the pool for a few seconds, and I got a decent look at the thing. It had that fatty pink-gray waterlogged color of something that's been dead and in the water for a little while, but not yet falling apart. It had a head and torso, from which trailed about half a dozen or so tentacle-like things, and they splayed out around it in the water, and a couple dragged in the mud. It was hairless and didn't look like it had ever had hair, but it wasn't scaly either. And it had a fucking face. Not a human face, not even close, but it had a face. It reminded me slightly of the face of a pug or a bat. It was wrinkled and kind of flat. It had a toothless, slack-open mouth, and I could see one of its eyes, which was that dead custard color. It scared the shit out of me so much that all my childish desire to examine or poke it with a stick was gone. I quickly ran back to my house and told my mom what I'd seen. My mom seemed worried and even interested and accompanied me back out so I could show her. By then, the current had carried it away, along with a couple of my dinosaurs, which was almost as upsetting as seeing that thing itself. We looked around and found one of the dinosaurs, but never found the thing. I was too nervous to play there for the next couple of days, which worried my parents because I really loved playing out there, and they tried to convince me that it was just a decaying dead animal or something. Eventually, I got over it and went on playing. A few years later, when I was 13 or 14, the whole incident came back to me in my mind, and I explored up the canyon to see if I could find anything, which I didn't. I never forgot seeing that thing. I know it could partially be explained away as the result of a creative, childish mind, or that it really was the decomposed remains of something else, but I remember it really clearly, more clearly than any of my other childhood memories. And the thing was really well defined and seemed very whole. I'd searched the internet for explanations and haven't found anything. I even looked into cryptids and stuff like that. Those globster things kind of remind me of it, but It was much, much more clearly composed. What the hell was it? Story 6. Be me. Have hankering to get into spots I'm not supposed to be. Like to urbex and explore just to take pictures and shit. Get into huge multi-level factory. Place is massive. Gonna break text for a moment, but for those of you who urbex a lot, especially in old factories in the Northeast, they have these big sliding fire doors that slide side to side instead of opening regular. Anyway, I usually go with one friend all the time. Wandering around having a good time. Decided to go to the mechanical level because I love old machinery. Place is subbed hell. Dark and only one way in. Through a big fire door. Looking around at the boilers that feed a hydro air unit that's absolutely massive. Friend is off looking at other stuff, not really paying attention, but close. Hear a thunk and the fire door rolling shut. Instantly feel claustrophobic. Freak out a little more than I'd like to admit. Friend calms me enough to think. Try the door. Can't slide it open though, it's stuck tight. Thinking that the hydro air unit must have a fresh air inlet that leads outside, we decide it's time to try that. Climb into the thing through a rod hole in the duct. Wasn't too small, so only had to crawl. Eventually see the levers at the end. Get to them and poke them open. Blinded by the sun. A few good kicks and they fall apart and I'm free. Friend and I double back to see what happened. Get to the fire door. The bar that wedged it open was now holding it shut. A third set of boot prints were next to ours. We followed them until they dead-ended on the concrete. Couldn't find the trail after that. Story 7. About 2 years ago, my younger cousin, 22 or something, was found dead outside his apartment by the police. His father, my uncle, had done time for slicing some guy's throat in a club when I was way younger. Anyway, my uncle on Christmas Eve shotgunned and killed another of my cousins. Female, about 22 as well, and her mother. Needless to say, they're all unstable druggies. Police arrested him easily enough and he's doing life. His other son, however, is closer to my age. He broke into the crime scene to try and get my uncle's cash and shit. He pulled the gun on the neighbors and kept demanding to know where the key to the safe was. Every day for the last 3 months he's been calling my house from jail, but I keep a gun loaded next to my bed just waiting for this crackhead to come breaking into my house. Not paranormal, but there you go. Reality for you. Story 8. Used to work on a mixed-sex NHS mental health ward. All of our residents were of retirement age, and we were the proverbial farm they were shipped off to when the secure psychiatric unit down the road deemed them placid enough for a less clinical setting. Lots of fascinating characters have been in prison for violent crimes, but were now confined to wheelchairs and no longer capable of offending. Get chatting to this one guy who had a history of attacking women and would talk in nonsensical riddles punctuated by shrieks and cackles. One of the few who was still able-bodied. He was a huge man and all the female staff were afraid of him. I'd help him rake leaves in the garden whilst he would tend to his plants because I felt a bit of a connection with him, you know? The guy was fascinating. I would stay after work and just watch the news on the television in the lounge with him. Now, I mentioned he would talk in riddles all the time, right? Well, one evening, whilst watching a report on the murder of a teenage girl by another teenage girl, without prompting, he made the most lucid, eloquent speech regarding the cruelty of modern society that I've ever heard. Felt a chill run down my spine at the realization that this crazy old man was, for all his sins, smart as fuck. Story 9. I was like 8 or 7 years old, running a really bad fever. Parents don't know what to do, so they call 999. They say put him in a bathtub full of cold water, so they do. I remember just being super cold, and then all of a sudden I was burning hot. I instantly go unconscious. There's this pop somewhere in the middle of my brain. I open my eyes and I'm floating about 2 feet above my body, looking up at the ceiling. Not a ceiling anymore. Hard to describe. I'm looking at some kind of desert. Looks almost like pictures of Mars. Really bleak. Seems to go on forever. Then there's a click, and an explosion a little ways away. Watch the smoke and fire for what feels like hours. Then I feel another pop, and I'm back in my body. My parents rush me to A&E. End up having a super bad case of the flu. Years later, in Afghanistan, we're out in the middle of nowhere. Humvee is keeping to a pre-designated path to try and avoid IEDs. We're just in a random spot in the desert, and all of a sudden I get this terrible feeling. Tell driver to stop. He does. Asks what's wrong. I tell him there's a bomb up ahead. They check it out. Sure enough, there's fucking signs of a fresh dig. It's enough that it would have completely vaporized us. I remember the night in the bathtub. I have absolutely no explanation for it. Story 10. I'm tired of all the bullshit occult threads dominating X, so here's something that happened to me that still bothers me. I have work in the morning, so I set an alarm for 6 a.m. Place my phone on the nightstand, shut off the light, and wrap myself up in a cocoon of blankets. Doze off and my phone starts going off. I knew there was no way it was already time to get up for work, so I reached my hand towards my phone on the nightstand to turn off my alarm. As I'm reaching over, I feel my fingers run through something that feels like hair. My heart was beating so hard that I thought it was going to come out of my chest. I jumped out of bed quick and bolted toward my light. Flipped it on, and there was nothing in my room. I figured I must have imagined it. I walk over to my phone to shut it off, and as I look down at my phone, there are 2 strands of dark hair intertwined in my fingers. My hair's blonde. I'd never been so fucking scared in my life. I still don't know who or what was 2 inches from my face that night.